Hi everyone, and welcome to the first Backend Fundamentals video. My name is Tristan, and I will be walking you through a three-part series to make sure that you have everything you need to be prepared and ready for the backend workshop at ZotHacks. We will start off by going over what a REST API is. To get started, here's a quick outline of what we'll be covering in this video. I'll first go over some terminology that we'll be using throughout this short series, and some terms that you might see online while developing. I'll then go over what a request looks like and the different types of requests you can make. And finally, I'll end with some examples of how to use a tool called Postman to make some of these requests. I first want to start off by defining what a backend is. Essentially, a backend is any part of an application that the user cannot see. Typically, the frontend and backend will communicate using an API. Now, an API stands for Application Programming Interface. It's a set of rules or protocols that allow programs to talk to each other. In our case, we'll be creating an API that will allow our front-end React app to communicate with our back-end Flask server. Additionally, many companies offer APIs that you can use to help integrate their services into your application. For example, Twitter has an API that you can use to get the latest tweets from a specific user. Now, REST is a specific API design. It's a set of rules that developers follow when they create their API. One of these rules is that you should always be able to access or modify data, otherwise known as a resource, using different types of requests. The main takeaway here is that REST APIs are resource-oriented. CRUD stands for Create, Read, Update, and Delete, and they're the basic operations that most APIs provide in order to modify and use stored data. This gives you pretty much complete control over the resources you're trying to access. Then we have JSON. JSON is a very common way to send data from an API using this kind of format. Here is an example of a JSON object. It should remind you a lot of how a Python dictionary looks. Within it, we have the data attribute, which corresponds to an array of objects. Each of these objects within the array have their own attributes and values. Whenever someone uses our API, they'll receive the information in this format. Next, I wanted to talk about the actual structure of a request. Here you can see a deconstructed URL, which makes up only part of a full request. Starting from the left, you have the protocol, which is normally HTTP or HTTPS. The only difference between the two is that HTTPS is encrypted. Then we have the domain name, in this case it's Site Checker, which can be purchased from various websites online and is the base of your URL. After that, we have the path, which is similar to how a file explorer handles folders on your computer. In this case, we are only accessing one directory, which is known as knowledge-base. Then we have the query string, which can be read as a series of key value pairs, also known as a dictionary. The query string can be identified by the question mark at the beginning, and every key value pair is separated by an equal sign. In this case, for example, name equals article, name being the key and article being the value. Additionally, these key value pairs are separated by an ampersand, which is the and symbol right here. Finally, we have the fragment at the end of the URL, and we don't need to worry about this too much since it's mainly used by the front end to either jump to a part of the page or do something else that reacts from JavaScript. The second part of request are the headers and the body. While you're probably already familiar with URLs on the previous slide from the URL bar in your browser, you might not know about the headers and body of a request. Headers are typically used to send metadata about the request. For example, time sent, size, and who sent the request. It can also be used for authentication, but that's for another series. In our case, we'll be using the header to signify to the backend that the body of our request is in a JSON format. The body of the request is where most of the data will be stored. Now, you might be thinking, why do we need a body if we can use the query string that we saw on the previous page in order to store key value pairs, which can be used in the backend? And to an extent you can, but it's not very good practice, and there's a much smaller limit in how much data can be stored in a query string versus a body. And then the last point is that a body should not be used with GET requests. And this leads me to the next slide where I'll talk about the different types of requests. Now I want to talk about the different types of requests, which are sometimes referred to as a method of the request. So when you send a request, it can be one of these several different types. I have 4 of the most commonly used types here, but more do exist. I'll quickly go over each one of them and what they're typically used for. So in this case, we have get, which is used to get a resource from a server. This fulfills the read part of CRUD. Then we have post, which is used to create a new resource on the server, which fulfills the create part. And then we have put, which is used to update a resource on the server, which is the update part. And then we have delete, which is used to delete a resource from a server. So these are actually just guidelines, and there's nothing preventing you, for example, from using a get or delete request to create a new resource on a server. It all depends how the backend was implemented, but not following these conventions can make things very confusing for end users. So now I'm going to run through accessing some APIs using a tool called Postman. Hopefully this will provide a meaningful example of all the terms we just went over. In order to get started with this Postman example, the first thing that you're going to want to do is go to the ZotHacks 2020 prerequisites document. From there, you'll click on the Backend Fundamental video bookmark, and you'll go to this GitHub link. From there, you're going to download the source code, and you're going to unzip the file. Once inside, you'll notice that there's a Postman collection.json in here. This is what we'll be using to import into our Postman in order to get access to some pre-made REST API requests. So if we open up Postman, this is what you'll see. You'll first want to click the import button in the upper left-hand corner. From there, you'll upload that file we had just talked about. So once you've successfully done that, you'll see something that looks like this. This will confirm that you've imported correctly. From there, you'll click on the Collections tab, and you'll notice a folder here. There are 4 different kinds of requests we have. They are the ones that we had mentioned earlier in the slides. We have create user, get user, update user, and delete user. Each with a different type: post, get, put, and delete. We'll start off with the get request. Before we do that though, you'll notice that in the URL, there's something with double brackets here, or double curly brackets. This means that there's an environmental variable that we need to fill in first. To do that, we can go to the upper right-hand corner and click the Manage Environments button. We'll click Add, and we'll say something like ZotHacks demo. The variable in this case, as we can see, is URL. For the value, we'll go back to the GitHub page, and we'll copy the link found in the description below. Make sure to not leave a trailing slash at the end of the URL. Then we can add. From there, we'll want to make sure that we actually select the environment, and we're ready to go. We'll first want to unclick this ID here, and we'll get to what this means later on. But let's hit send and see what happens. It might take a little bit of time because we're using Heroku instance, which goes to sleep after someone doesn't use it for a little bit. So in this case, the response we got back was a JSON object that we mentioned before, and it's got a data attribute with an array of 1 object. So what just happened here was we made a request to the backend server with no query string. The only thing we provided was a path /user. And this, based on the backend that we developed, we said that our resource in this case is a user, and we want to retrieve all the users that we currently have. We can specify our search by including a query parameter. In this case, let's say we want to query by the ID field. We can paste in the ID that we just found and paste it into the value here. You'll notice that it'll also update the URL above. What this is doing is URL encoding this kind of form here into the URL. Remember, the underscore ID is the key, and then everything after the equal sign is the value. Now, the request is going to return the exact same thing because all we did was specify for a search that matched the exact same parameters that we had before, or the same values that we had before. So let's try to change it up. What happens if I slightly change the ID? Let's say instead of 4, it's 3. Well, obviously, we're not going to get any response back because that's not a valid ID. We can also query by different parameters. Let's say instead we wanted to query by email. We can enter that field and we can copy this email. And we can uncheck the ID. You'll notice that it removes it from the request entirely. Again, this will give us the exact same result. Let's take a look at the headers really quick. As you'll notice, it says 7 hidden headers. If we click the hidden button, it'll expand all of the different headers that Postman automatically includes. Most of these you don't really have to worry about. And then we'll notice that the body of the request is also empty. This is because, as we mentioned before, GET requests don't include a body. So now that we've taken enough look at GET user, let's check out create user. Create user doesn't have any query parameters. You'll notice that it's empty here. Instead, create user uses a body. So you'll see here that there are 3 different attributes that we provide. One is missing. That's the ID attribute, and that's automatically generated once the user is created. So let's send a request to the server to create a user. So we'll see that what we got back was the fields that we just had entered and an ID. So this is the ID for that user that we just created. We don't get to set the ID, the server sets one for us. Let's create another user instead. Let's call it Tristan and Tristan test. Tristan user. Let's create another user. Okay, so we'll get back pretty much a confirmation of what we just inputted, and we got back another ID. Now let's go back to that GET request and see if we can access using that ID. Or actually, let's see what happens if we don't include any parameters. What should we expect? Probably 3 different users, because we just created 2 and there was one that already existed. As you can see, that pretty much matches what we expected. So if we want to specifically pick one specific user, a good way of doing that would be to use the ID, since the ID will always be unique to that user. So let's replace that ID that I just copied from the user we just created, and let's search. So we'll get back the only user that matches this, which is the one we just made. So that's create user and get user. Again, since this is the way that we have designed our post endpoint is that it doesn't need any query parameters and only uses the body, which is in a JSON format. One thing that we will notice though is that within the headers that are automatically generated by Postman, there's a specific header called content type, and that tells the server that it should be expecting a body, which is in a JSON format. Postman fortunately handles a lot of this stuff for you, so you don't even have to think about it. Now let's check out update user. Update user requires an ID field here. This is because in order to update something, we need to be able to update it uniquely and with its ID. So let's update that user we just created. So I'll paste in that ID we got before, and we'll go into the body and change a field. So as you can see here, there's some values already pre-created. I think these are fine. We'll try that, and we'll send. So this sends back a confirmation of what just was changed. So this was the ID we had provided, as well as the new updated email, first name and last name. So if we go back to GET, although we didn't change anything in this request, if I resubmit it, the email, first name have changed based on what we put in the put request. And finally, we have the delete user request. This, again, similarly to the update user, requires that we have the ID in the query parameter string. This is the only value that we have to provide because we just have to say which one we have to delete. So we'll delete that user we've been working on. Once it's successful, we'll get a message back that the user was deleted. And again, just to make sure, we can use the get endpoint again and see if it's successfully deleted. And yes, sure enough, there's no longer a user that exists with that ID. So this was a basic overview of how to use 4 different endpoints, each of a different type, in order to handle a different resource. Again, this follows the REST API kind of pattern, and we'll be going through more examples and how it's implemented in code in a future video.